Have your attention just for a second. Please continue your lunch, but I'd like to start with our program today. As I said, please continue eating lunch. I'm not trying to rush anybody, but welcome to the Security and Strategy program here at SMU. For our very special program today with Dr. Gregory Treverton of the National Intelligence Council. Today's program is co-sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth and the SMU Tower Center under the auspices of the Security and Strategy program here at SMU. Welcome to our board members who have come today. I think I saw Jane Wetzel walking around somewhere. There you are, Jane. Welcome. Welcome to our forum members. Deirdre Williams, welcome to our supporters at Blessing. Thank you so much for coming and all you do for the center. And thanks, students, faculty, and friends of the program. For those of you who haven't been to an SAS event before, I'll tell you briefly about what we're trying to do here at SMU. We're building a program which focuses on two big issues: strategy, how you think about the use of force in international politics, and security, how you remain safe, how you think about maintaining prosperity and national security, regardless of whether the use of force is on the table. This is a big, complicated set of issues, security and strategy, and it's not something that any one scholar or any one practitioner can do on his or her own. These are complicated issues. So we like to bring in scholars from various disciplines: law, history, economics, political science, engineering, computer science, and so forth. And we also like to bring in practitioners, policymakers, military officials, diplomats, correspondents, members of the intelligence community, a whole range of people who are involved on a day-to-day basis with issues relating to international security. Once in a while, we get somebody who lives in both worlds and has done so for a very, very long time. That's our speaker today, Greg Treverton. Dr. Treverton, as your bio cards will indicate, is currently the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, and he'll tell you more about what the council does and what purposes it serves. But he has a long career both in the scholarly world and in the policy world. He's the author of some of the most important works on intelligence studies, including, I would point out, these two books, very dog-eared copies that I've had on my shelf for a long time: Reforming National Intelligence for an Age of Information, and his recent book, Intelligence in an Age of Terror. These books are particularly important because they deal with intelligence at a time of great technological change and at a time in which we are reconsidering what constitutes a threat to national security. This isn't the Cold War anymore, and people are starting to wonder whether or not the age of terror should define how we think about intelligence. I'll say one other thing before I stop yammering on and turn the floor to our speaker. You cannot understand national security controversies today without thinking very, very hard about intelligence issues. Just think back over the last 20 years, the major controversies in American national security and foreign policy: 9/11, the war in Iraq, controversies over Iran's nuclear program, controversies over the rise of China, controversies over how we deal with issues like Russia. All of these issues are intimately wrapped up with debates about intelligence, what purposes it serves, what role it provides, and some of the inherent tensions of a secret intelligence community existing in a democracy. We need to think about intelligence hard. Nobody has thought longer or harder about these issues, perhaps, than our speaker today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gregory Treverton.
Thanks, Josh. It's a great treat to be here and see some old friends and meet some new ones. I should introduce my colleagues, Adam Jones and Tim Barrett. If you ask a really hard question, I'll turn to them for the answer. But it's been great to have them with. But it is a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk about the National Intelligence Council. What I thought I'd do is say a few words about us and where we fit in the policy process, talk a little bit then about how we do our work, and then turn to our signature unclassified longer-term product, which is called Global Trends. We're very much in the middle of the crunch period of producing that. It will come out next December, Notice December safely after November. Last thing we do is want to get it involved in politics, but I'll say a word about it and maybe give you a kind of preview of the things we're thinking about as we look out further. The NIC is the Director of National Intelligence's interagency arm for intelligence analysis. We've worked for the Director of Central Intelligence before, but in the Director's capacity as Director of Central Intelligence, not as Director of the CIA. Many people in Washington think we're a CIA organization. We haven't been for 40 years, but things move slowly occasionally, even in Washington. So we've worked for the Director of Central Intelligence and now for the Director of National Intelligence. We're an interagency operation. We bring together all of the various intelligence agencies, and we are composed of people from all the various intelligence agencies. We're about 150 strong. We have organized like a State Department. We have national intelligence officers for regions and for functions. They have several deputies. The national intelligence officers, or NIOs in our parlance, come from outside government, from other government agencies, and many of them come from other intelligence agencies. It's a terrific mix of people. The deputies almost all come from other American intelligence agencies, but a very wide range, not just CIA, DIA, NSA, those, but I have a deputy from Secret Service, another good analyst from NYPD, so it's a wonderful range of people. The big change, I was vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council almost 20 years ago now. Shows you how slow a riser I am. But it's wonderful to be back as chairman. But then we were almost entirely doing strategic intelligence. That's not necessarily longer-term intelligence, but some of that, but work that tried to put an issue in context, tried to show connections across issues, tried to provide a framework for policy people to think about particular issues. That has been the traditional and historic mission of the NIC. We're most identified with national intelligence estimates, sort of what the government thinks and how it sees an important issue both now and looking forward. That's still the mission I care about. But the big change for me is that we're now deeply engaged, up to our eyeballs, I might say, in current intelligence support. We provide the main support to the two main policy-making bodies in the U.S. government on foreign policy, the Principals Committee, that's the cabinet secretaries and foreign affairs agencies, and probably more to the point, the Deputies Committee, the deputies in those foreign affairs agencies. The Deputies Committee particularly meets at least once every day, often twice, sometimes three times. It's meant to tee up issues for the principals, meant to look at alternatives, and the amount of work it spawns for us is just enormous. So what will happen is we'll get a question from the Deputies Committee, and if they want to know what the CIA thinks about that issue, they can just ask the CIA, but typically they want to know what the intelligence community, what the various intelligence agencies think. Do they agree? Do they disagree? What are the disagreements? That's us. So when that happens, we'll get what we call a tasking. That'll come to us. The national intelligence officer concerned, or several, if it cuts across several accounts, will then put together their communities of intelligence analysts from all the agencies. They'll decide how they answer the question, who's going to write the draft, and then when that's done, it'll come back and they'll meet again in sessions we call, with some euphemism, coordination. Coordination means arguing about it and seeing if you agree. When I was at the NIC before, I had a crotchety analyst, a good guy, but he was kind of a CIA person, but he didn't quite fit in the CIA's very round personnel holes, so he was always in trouble, but he was a wonderful character. But I used to encourage him and his colleagues at the little analytic group I had to be in these coordination sessions. And at one point, in one session, things got heated, and somebody from another agency turned to him and said, "Why are you here? Who do you represent?" And he said, without batting an eyelash, "I represent the English language." And so he did. You can imagine in these coordination sessions, the first casualty is often the English language, and that's a challenge for us all the time. But the pace of events there means that the national intelligence officers and their deputies who are working on hot accounts, Ukraine, Russia, ISIL, all those, they could spend their entire lives preparing for, going to, and following up on White House meetings. So the challenge for me then is to help us find opportunity to do more strategic work to help raise people's sights a bit. The numbers will give you some sense. Last year we produced some 700 pieces of paper. Of those, about 400 were signed memorandums from a national intelligence officer to Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, her deputy, or a senior NSC officer. So those were things that came more or less directly out of the Deputies Committee deliberations, things they wanted to ask us. Now, not all of the questions we get asked by them are straightforward, tactical, operational. They'll often begin to ask us questions that are, for me, just exactly the sort of questions I think intelligence and policy should interact over. They'll ask us, if we do this, how do you judge Putin will respond? What would be the effect of this set of actions? That's just the kind of dialogue I want to have. But the challenge really is trying to find ways to be a bit more strategic. We talk about this all the time within the NIC. We had a conversation the other day, and one terrific young deputy in IO from the State Department said, boy, I really liked having the chance to write that more strategic paper. He said, I had 6 hours. So 6 hours of deep strategic thought is probably not what I would like, but it may be better than nothing. In any case, that is the continuing challenge. At the other end of our work is the Global Trends series. This is about the 6th in the series we do. So their effort, the NIC has done every 4 years to look out as far as 20 years. So the one that's available now is called Global Trends 2030. It's easily available on the web. It's been a wonderful exercise for the NIC. It's been a good branding device for us. I didn't get to do one when I was vice chairman, but I did play some role in thinking up the idea. And I had 2 main purposes. One, if you're going to look out more than a year, none of that secret stuff on our computers helps you much. What helps you if you're going to look out further is talking to the experts, being around, visiting different countries, talking to Wall Street, talking to think tankers and others. This year, by the time we do Global Trends, which should in the series be Global Trends 2035, but I'm not going to have a number on it. So if you have ideas, it's got to be Global Trends something, but if you have an idea of what the rest of the title should be, I would welcome it. Don't keep it to yourself. But we will, by the time we publish Global Trends XXX, whatever it's going to be called, we will have been in about 35 countries. We'll have touched in one way or another some 2,000 people. So it's been a great exercise at reaching out. We need to do that in general. I want the National Intelligence Council to be the most visible, the most transparent, the most out there part of the intelligence world, and Global Trends is both a fact of doing that and builds the reputation for doing so. People are now used to us coming around with questions, with drafts, and working with them. It's been a wonderful exercise. This year we've tried particularly to reach beyond the usual experts and government officials. So we've done lots of sessions with women's groups. We did a session with entrepreneurs in Bangalore. We had a focus group with students in Mexico City. We've met with transparency groups in lots of parts of the world. It's been a wonderful exercise. So both bespeaking and actually reaching out has been an important part of the Global Trends work. I think maybe we get a slight cachet for being an intelligence agency. Lots of other people do similar exercises, but I think we're the only intelligence service that does it. The second insight I had, being a Washingtonian, was that it had to be unclassified. It had to be unclassified for lots of reasons, but one particular one was that I knew the only way we'd ever get our policy counterparts to pay any attention to something so long range was if they saw it in the press. if we gave them this document, give them this nice classified document, they would say, oh, thanks, this is terrific. I'll read it when I have a chance, right? That chance would never come. But if they see some mention of this document in the press, then they'll turn to their special assistants and say, what the devil is the Nick up to? What's going on here? And we'll get some attention. And that's worked very well, very well. The current administration has often cites Global Trends 2030 as kind of the backdrop for their strategic planning. So it's been an important, I think, addition. The fact that it's public and that we talk about it, we'll take drafts to China, we'll take drafts to Russia and talk about them there. So it's been a wonderful exercise overall. I might conclude with just a few comments about things we are thinking about in this Global Trends. Let me give you a list of themes that we're working on that I think will be important in the Global Trends, the next Global Trends. One is really the empowerment of individuals and small groups. In the previous Global Trends, we talked about the power shift toward Asia. That continues. So too does the diminishing power of Europe. But in this one, we'll underscore the empowerment of individuals and small groups. That's obvious in the case of terrorists. Individual terrorists can do an awful lot of havoc, but it's also true in other ways as well. When the Gates Foundation spends more on health in Africa than the World Health Organization, the empowerment of individuals is obvious. And that's something will be a theme of this year's work. On the negative side, that does have an implication we'll also draw, and that is the empowerment of individuals and small groups is one among several reasons why we imagine that collective action to meet problems of the global commons, like climate change, will be harder. There'll be more actors involved, more with a kind of veto power. We imagine that collective action will be possible where the threat is plainly shared, pandemics, but probably less so in areas where the threat is expensive to deal with or less clearly shared. Second on this list is economic stagnation. We, like a lot of people, imagine that global growth rates will be slower in the future than in the recent past, in the last couple decades. Structural change is happening in the global economy. That has a number of implications. It means that convergence between poor countries and rich will slow. It means that inequality, both within countries and across them, will not shrink and may get worse. It means that a number of people who've been lifted out of poverty, not just primarily in China, but not just in China, places like Brazil, are in danger of falling back into poverty. We did a swing through Latin America as part of Global Trends last summer, and I was struck there by how hard it is to draw people out of poverty, but in some ways it's even harder to meet their expectations once they achieve a kind of marginal middle class status. That means there'll be kind of a global scramble for good middle class jobs. That's likely to have some nasty competitive edges to it. Third on this list would be competitions of values. One that's most on my mind at the moment is what I've come to call the prosperity presumption. We Americans tend to believe, I think, pretty deeply and almost subconsciously that prosperity makes everything better. It makes people happier, makes them more likely to be democratic, less likely to go to war with each other, and all those things may well be true. Indeed, there's some evidence for some of them. But then we run into a group like ISIL that doesn't care at all about prosperity, has no interest in prosperity, shares none of that presumption. Well, that's a very stark example of the values conflicts out there. More subtle but important is really Chinese attitudes toward international institutions. They plainly believe that those institutions were, if not made in America, at least made in the West, and they want to either adjust them or supplant them with institutions that they find more congenial. Fourth on this list is technology. Here I think we will focus on two. One is artificial intelligence, the other is bio. I'd come to think, the famous line about Brazil, said about Brazil that Brazil was the country of the future and always would be. unfortunately, that looks altogether too true again. I'm a Brazilian hand, and so it pains me to see the same cycle happen all over again with Brazil. But I had thought that artificial intelligence was the technological equivalent of Brazil, the technology of the future that always would be. But now I think it's here, and there the first implication will be pretty severe disruption in job markets around the world, including here. There's a recent British study that suggests that half American jobs are vulnerable over a couple decades to being automated, completely or in part. And it turns out that it's a lot easier to help a computer learn how to do accounting than how to give a good massage. So a lot of the jobs at risk are ones we would think of as relatively professional. So that's the main implication. And I think the one that'll hit the soonest. There's been a lot of concern by Elon Musk and others about will these computers take over and outrun our ability to control that? That's an issue, but that's an issue probably for 30 years, not for 5 or 15 or 20. On the bio front, all my time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'd never been to the Media Lab at MIT. If you're there, I do visit. It is a spectacular place. But the watchword from a day there last fall was that bio is today where IT was 25 years ago, poised for an amazing flowering. Already we see CRISPR-Cas9, the kinds of things it can do, pretty elementary but impressive, and over a longer time period, the possibilities are really enormous. Some of them on the good, they'll be good on the good side. There'll be lots of good things happening, lots of things that will improve quality of life and prolong it. Interesting, many of those will also increase inequality, since those are going to be available to rich people in rich countries before they're available to poor people in poor countries, so there will be an inequality dimension. On the downside, it's easy to see, and we worry about lots of the possibilities in bio. We pointed attention recently in some of our work to the possibility that bioweapons might be targeted on particular ethnic groups, even particular individuals. That's a ways away, but it's plainly something we can imagine. I don't want to be too dark here. I realize I'm being the usual intelligence officer. It said of intelligence officers that when they see flowers, they think of coffins. Forgive me if I duplicate or represent that problem. Next on the list really is, for me, is what seems an increasing disconnect in many places around the world, different manifestations, but a disconnect between citizens and their governments. We see it in a pretty striking way here in the United States, but we see it also in Europe and other places. As I say, it has different manifestations in different places, but it is, there are big changes underway in both the nature of the state and its relation to its citizens. We see lots of migration that's purely economic in form. People have no particular interest in being a citizen of another country like ours. They just want to be there and be able to work there. So others want to carve out a kind of special place for themselves in a country, don't necessarily want to run it or control it, but would like to have a special position for themselves. So I think there are interesting things afoot. These are not new, they've been going on, but interesting things that we'll watch and try and play out in some sense in our work as we try to look out first 5 years and then 20 years. Last on this list, I'm eager to hear your comments and questions, is really the changing nature of warfare. Here too, I think I have more questions than answers. The things seem to be changing in pretty fundamental ways, and I'm not quite sure how it all nets out. But if you look at the kind of brutality reflected by ISIL, that's not new. We know the human species is no stranger to brutality, but it is striking. You put that together with the likelihood that the kinds of instruments and weapons that we have, from drones to nanotechnology, they will be available sooner or later to our adversaries as well. And if you think about the Middle East, it's plain that in the Middle East, the long blurring line between combatants and non-combatants. That's been going on for a long time as well, but that's all but vanished. And that does seem to me to reflect a somewhat different approach, somewhat different phenomenon of war. Maybe for that, the 2006 conflict between Israel and Hezbollah is an indicator, but so is many of the things that are going on in the Middle East. Well, I have committed the intelligence analyst fallacy, but let me stop there and look forward to your questions and comments about things I've said or things I haven't said. So
Do you have...
You need mics?
Do you have the mics coming? Great. I'll take it.
There's one here. Yep.
There is the next one. Great. Well, first, thank you very much for a marvelous talk. A large number of provocative issues. We go in a million different directions. I'm very curious to see what people are interested in. I'm an old intelligence scholar, so I'm interested in one of the first things you said. You mentioned that the National Intelligence Council is now up to its eyeballs in current issues. I'm wondering if you think that this is healthy, because people that think about Washington and they think about strategy and intelligence and national security, they always bemoan the lack of long-term thinking. Yeah. So everybody's always wrapped up in what's happening in the next 5 minutes. Wouldn't it be super if we just had one place where people could think about the long term? Well, in some respects, the NIC could be that place and has served as that place for a long time. Is this shift to more current intelligence, while understandable, is it also problematic?
Like so many things in life, it has a good side and a bad side. When I was at the NIC before, we worried a lot about, are we relevant? Well, we don't worry about that anymore. We're relevant. We're up to our necks in relevance. So in that sense, it's a good thing, and the fact that NIOs and their deputies are in all these meetings, see what's going on, know what's going on, is great, because one of the great challenges for intelligence is being useful. I used to, when I was at the NIC before, bore my colleagues. I used to say that almost everything we did at the NIC was interesting. The question is it interesting and useful? I still see a lot of intelligence pieces that are wonderful answers to a question nobody's remotely asking. Right? Sometimes maybe they should be, but often nobody's asking the question. But it is, the downside is very much, as Josh suggests, the fact that we're not doing as much longer-term thinking as I would like. And I do think of the NIC as kind of the clubhouse in the government for people that want to be strategic. So what I've been trying to do is reach out to other pockets of analysts at the CIA, DI, and elsewhere who are strategic and would like to be more strategic. We'll do some co-branding, I think, but it is a continual challenge because the time horizon just keeps shrinking and shrinking. The urgency of the immediate drives out the important, and trying to get people to think longer term really is a challenge. I should say that I had long ago at the beginning of my career determined that I would avoid the Middle East. That's over. That's really over. Sometimes I feel like I do all ISIL all the time, but it's a help. Maybe in my defense, maybe not having done the Middle East my whole life, I bring a somewhat different perspective to it. At least that's what I hope. But the challenge of the longer term thinking is really on my mind every hour of every day. Yes, sir.
I hope the question is appropriate.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry.
So everybody can hear you.
I hope the question is appropriate. We hear, and bringing up the Middle East was a really good example, is we hear that the Middle East is the biggest problem that exists today. Russia is the biggest problem that exists today. The biggest danger is coming out of Asia. So we have, based on the work that you all are doing, is to where you see the more serious risks for the relatively near-term future, which part of the world seems to have. I know where it's getting the most attention, but where the stress or the danger might be coming from?
Oh, absolutely. I don't get to do this very much, but when I can, I sort of outline my priorities for our work. Not in terms necessarily of threat, or not in terms just of threat, but in terms of national interests. So when I go down that list, China and its neighbors, absolutely the top, second most important country in the world, and a country that I think is likely to have some pretty serious bumps in the road, even in the next 5 years, and certainly in the next 20. So that's top of my list. Second on my list would be cyber. Cyber is just the air we breathe. It's so important. Third on my list would be Europe, Russia, that tangle of issues. This is really a very difficult time for Europe. It finds itself with the preeminent European institution, the European Union, that was built entirely around open economics, open borders, and now it faces a security challenge for which the Union is, at the best, ill-suited and maybe a positive handicap in trying to deal with the kind of security problem they face. So that said, and then there's always the uncertainty about how Putin is going to behave or misbehave in Russia, as well as other places. For me, the Middle East and terrorism is fourth on the list. That's not the way politics works. Politics drives it absolutely to the top. And it is interesting. I've never quite understood, but terrorism frightens people, especially frightens Americans, well beyond the numbers. If you looked at the numbers, I don't know if you saw President Obama's interview with Jeff Goldberg, but he said it. If you look at the numbers, you should worry more about falling in your bathtub than about terrorism. But that's not what the polls show. If you look at the polls after San Bernardino, it's something like 30% of the people thought they were at risk personally from a terrorist in the next year. That's orders of magnitude beyond the real numbers, but terrorism does go to the top. Jerry Bremer, who was czar of counterterrorism before he was czar of Iraq, used to say that no issue went from 0 to 60 faster in American politics than terrorism, and that's really true. Yes,
Reg, thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot. Really appreciated your talk. And I want to follow up first on Josh's question and ask what you would say about the effect of our 4-year political cycles, which are now really year-round, of going into elections year-round, and how that impacts what you do or might do. And then my second question was that you haven't mentioned health issues in the trends. So what's your comment on that?
Well, if I don't get to, in my job, I pretty much have to stay away from things American, though increasingly we are going to put the United States into the equation. Over 20 years, we certainly will. I don't know whether I'll have the nerve, but I'd like to end with a kind of scenarios exercise where it seems to me the two biggest uncertainties as we look out 5 years and beyond are about the two biggest powers, China and us. It's really a big set of uncertainties. As I say, I'm not sure I'll be brave enough to do it, but we'll certainly try and include the United States. In the immediate, the fact of election cycles doesn't much affect my work. We do work for primarily for whichever administration is in power and are driven by their agendas. We must be. Congress is an important consumer, but I tend to have good relations with the Congress. They're supportive of analysis on the NIC. So occasionally they'll ding us over something, but that's just the pace of the town. It really is the longer term issues about gridlock and will we be responsible? Are we going to be sort of sullen and withdrawn? Not to mention occasionally demanding and outrageous. Are we going to be constructive? Those are really important questions, and to a great extent, it's not as though we're as dominant as we have been in the past, but still, to a considerable extent, will determine the future we face. That is really a big uncertainty. Health, I think, runs through everything. I didn't mention it. It is particularly visible in the technological sphere, and I mentioned pandemics as a possibility. So those are issues a lot on our mind. I didn't talk much about climate change. That's been an issue we've worked quite a lot on. That's, again, in the backdrop. We might, I'm tempted, and my colleagues are tempted to do a scenario that takes the more recent suggestions that the effects of climate change may be much sooner than we've expected, 20 years, not 50 or 70, and do a scenario and see what that looks like. If we got many more extreme weather events and maybe even got significant places going underwater, people getting their feet wet, but moving before they get their feet wet, that'd be an interesting scenario to look at. Yeah, ma'am. See you.
Hi, my name is Mona Shah. I'm a journalist from Pakistan, currently a student at SMU.
Oh, great.
There are fundamentalist religious groups in Pakistan who threaten the government and the civil society, of which I'm a big part of, on a regular basis. These are the same groups that have pledged allegiance to ISIS. Now, I asked the same question to an FBI agent, and he was here at this college for a lecture, and he said if he's not threatening the US, they can't really intervene. So I ask you the same question, that isn't it a problem that's waiting to happen in near future if they have already pledged allegiance to ISIS and are so strong that the government actually takes their side instead of arresting them or shutting down their madrasas that they function under religious organizations' names?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Basically, that's a challenge for Pakistan, and we're obviously prepared to help. And from an intelligence perspective, it's not as though we would, if we had information about an imminent attack, we wouldn't keep that. We would share that with our counterparts. So there may be a difference between the FBI actually doing some operations, but on the intelligence sharing front, it's not always as easy as we'd like, because we need to be careful that sources don't get blown in the process. But in general, we share threat information with lots of countries around the world, and they share with us as well. You've seen that in the commentary about both the Paris and the Brussels bombings.
Thank you.
Sir.
How adequate is our intelligence in North Korea, and how do you get that information, if you do get it, in a closed society like that?
Yeah, I know. North Korea. Yeah, it's I think our intelligence is not great, but it's not. It's on the technical side, it's pretty good. Not as good as we'd like, but it's relatively good on the technical side. In terms of intentions, that's always the hardest part, particularly when you have someone who's pretty erratic as Kim Jong-un is. So it's a problem. There has been an increasing flow of NGOs and others into North Korea, so there are more people to talk to who've been there, who've seen things. That helps, I think. So I think we do okay, but it's a crazy place. The idea that this absolutely failed country can make a ballistic missile submarine kind of boggles your mind. It certainly does mine. But it is, in one sense, it's sort of hard to take seriously. On the other hand, you have to, because they've got this stuff and could do a lot of damage, maybe not to us yet, but certainly to South Korea. So we actually have a national intelligence officer. I have about 17 national intelligence officers, but we have a single officer for Korea who just worries about Korea, mostly North Korea, but South as well. Sir. I think I'm having a frontis bias. I'll get people in the back. So.
Well, we got here earlier.
Absolutely.
You were talking earlier, or at least mentioned one of your concerns about the disconnect between citizens and their government. But 20 years ago, my colleagues and I were comfortable going to a U.S. embassy in another country and sharing basically the names and the occupations of those people we were going to do business with, and we could get some feedback from the embassy personnel. Today, it's almost impossible to walk up to an embassy as a citizen and even get in the door, let alone offer any kind of an exchange of who we're working with and what we know about them. It seems to me there's more boots on the ground when you look at civilians in these countries, hopefully, than there are government personnel. And is that a trend that is even recognized? And if it is recognized, where are we going? Because frankly, between FACTA, which means that every dollar transaction has to be reported in one way or another back to our government, it's causing banks to not even do business with Americans. And then Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes any kind of interplay between a business person and somebody who may know somebody who's in government. I mean, the onerous penalties of making mistakes is actually keeping Americans home. And I just would like to solicit comment.
It's certainly something I hear pretty often, and so I take it seriously. There are always trade-offs between things we'd like to do in a world that doesn't always behave as we'd like it to behave, and foreign corrupt practices is a piece of that, I suspect. Sometimes people say to me, we basically end up leaving business to the Russians and the Chinese and others who don't care. So I take that seriously. It is, I think, the dilemma of trying to display our values in a world that doesn't always share them or isn't always prepared to abide by them. The other, where you started, I have the same feeling that we have these embassies that are mostly now in the self-protection business, in the forced protection business, and I wonder, really how much value we get from all those people there if they're mostly just being careful enough to protect themselves. Extreme examples, a place like Pakistan, where, except for the ambassador, most people serve only a year tour, right? So they spend a year, therefore have no institutional memory, very little experience, and mostly have to travel around in armed cars. Right? So you wonder, how are we learning anything from that? That means I think we're dependent on the local people that work with us, and that's fine too, but it does make you think in this world of instantaneous communication about the value of big embassies in lots of places. Yes, ma'am.
To that point, after 9/11, to that point after 9/11, acts like the Patriot Act really started to close our borders. And so from an intelligence perspective, we really lost out on a lot of the foreigners that would have come in naturally, that would have been good allies and agents in some of these hotspots. How is Nick working to recruit individuals that traditionally we probably would have brought in prior to 9/11, but now we've really restricted their ability to come in, and how is that inhibiting our ability to get true intelligence on the ground?
I haven't looked at the numbers, but I think there was obviously some effect immediately post 9/11, but I think we've tried and mostly, not entirely, but mostly tried to make it possible to get the kind of H-1 visas and other things that do bring those non-Americans we'd like to have here. For intelligence purposes, we mostly, for better or worse, most of the people who work for intelligence services are Americans. They can be people who are naturalized Americans. I wish we made better use of people that aren't Americans, even here. And I'm struck by that all the time when I travel. There's so many people out there that I had a colleague, I was a visiting professor for the last 6 years before I did this in Stockholm. I was there 3 times a year. And I had a colleague, a young colleague, a woman who would have been a terrific CIA analyst, and she would like to do it, but she wasn't an American citizen. She spoke lots of languages, Swedish, some African languages. She was terrific. So I wish we could find ways to do that. We've gotten better in the intelligence agencies in diversity across Americans, but even there, since to work for where I work or at the CIA, you have to go through a polygraph and a background investigation. It does mean that we weed out, it seems to me, lots of people who might be interestingly creative, a little bit zany, might have some unusual ideas, and that's too bad. I wish we could do better at that. But that's a continuing challenge, one that, frankly, the Snowden episode has made a little worse. Yeah, you're there.
Thank you. In the recent past 10, 20 years, the intelligence community has undergone an evolution from what was structured to a structure specifically designed for the Cold War to evolve into what was needed for what was called the Global War on Terror at the time. All the threats you're talking about today are more diverse, more dispersed, more amorphous. And that's something that strikes me as a very different kind of structure, probably in terms of personnel needed for the analysis and different kinds of assets to collect the data that's going to be relevant to answering those questions and others. Is that, do you find it to be a struggle for, as intelligence community leaders, to A, knowing what kind of investment you want to be making to look at emerging threats, and B, actually getting that to be realized beyond what's, with policy leaders, beyond what's immediately in front of them today?
Well, I think the biggest adjustment has been about the terrorist threat, and there I think we've done it, maybe overdone it. I worry from an analytics point of view that I understand the focus on counterterrorism. It's really politically driven and driven by our politics and concerns, and that's entirely appropriate. But from an analytic point of view, I do worry about it. It means that when we look at a country like Nigeria, there's not a lot of Nigeria in it. It's mostly about Boko Haram. And even when we look at Boko Haram, there's not a lot of Boko Haram in it. It's mostly about networks and individuals and targeting, not where do these people come from, where might they go, why are they doing what they're doing. Obviously, we're interested in those questions, but the focus very much is the counter-terror piece of the terrorism problem. So in that sense, I think we've created the National Counterterrorism Center and lots of other things. That works pretty well. How well we're structured to deal with some of the other newer, more amorphous threats. We've been experimenting a lot in the cyber realm. We've now recently set up in the intelligence community, a Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. My first reaction to that idea was, oh no, here we go again. There are 5 existing cyber centers in the government already, and since they don't talk to each other very well, the solution was to create a 6th. That seemed like a sort of caricature of government. But it turns out, I think, probably be a good thing. The 5 had very different missions and different approaches and somewhat different methods. So creating a place to integrate information about the cyber threat probably is a good thing to do. But it does reflect our sort of the difficulty in dealing with that particular threat, which has all the problems of being mostly in the private sector, but a public interest is really a very difficult problem for us, and I think for most countries around the world to come to grips with. Yeah, right, across the... Sorry to point.
Partly related to the health issue mentioned earlier that I didn't hear you mention in your list of global trends is the changing demographics in countries like Japan and Russia with aging populations and how that is going to factor into your intelligence analysis.
Yeah, great point. I didn't mention it because I think we understand it pretty well. It's sort of built into how we think about the world these days. We understand the demographics of the aging countries. We understand the places where there continue to be youth bulges and the concerns those raise about instability. Particularly, we have lots of young men with bad prospects for anything. So I think that we understand that pretty well. The one that we're just coming to face with is one the Chinese are facing, and that is they're near the demographic cliff, and they're near that cliff when they're still quite poor in per capita terms, not like Japan or Europe that got to the aging cliff when they were rich. So that is one that's interesting to see how it plays out. It certainly accounts for part of the rush Chinese leaders have to make the economy reform and move, but that's not going so well either. So demographics really is critically important, but I think we basically, China partly accepted, we understand it pretty well and understand its implications. I would say about the migration to Europe, that in some sense it was a development we knew was going to happen. Europe needs people, it's aging, it needs immigrants. The only places those could really come from were the Middle East and North Africa, but we expected that to happen over decades, not weekends or months. And the same is true. Japan has a particularly acute problem because it's so closed on these matters. But they are important. I think they're sort of the backdrop for almost all the things we do and think about. Yes, sir.
kind of a follow-up along that. I really appreciate how among the trends you mentioned were things like the destabilization of future markets, destabilization of wealth distribution and things like that. And what we see is that like you said, our conversation always drifts to terrorism, to foreign dynamics and things. And these are some of the trends you mentioned are things that I actually am concerned about. But what I find is blank stares when we talk about the destabilized job market. So my question is, we have the intelligence, but do we have the consumers of this intelligence? It seems that there's such an urgency to simplify and politicize that we are not intelligently discoursing about these trends that really have a much greater, it sounds like, potential to destabilize our security, because they're not the interesting dynamics. They're not the people shooting up a store. They are the self-driving cars that suddenly destabilize and create mass unemployment. Who is the consumer of intelligence? Do you have any thoughts on how to make that intelligence less politicized and simplified?
I think I wouldn't call it simplified or politicized necessarily. It's a question of, can you do something about it, right? If I'm a policymaker, now, as you can imagine, our policy counterparts have a future horizon that's measured in days, right? not years or months. But in general, if you have an administration that worries most about the next 4 years at most, then the question becomes, can we do something about it? And often I'll hear in deputies committee meetings these days, given the gridlock on the Hill, where people will say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? But of course, there's no chance we can get that through Congress, right? So I think it's not so much the simplification, and often it's not so much the short-termism that drives out an attention to something slightly longer term. It's some of that, but it's also the sense that, well, is there anything I can really do about this? I used to think of intelligence people and policy people as coming from somewhat different tribes. Now, the tribal markings were not indelible, and some people have moved back and forth. But if you think about how different those groups are, most policy people overstate the effect their actions can have on the world. They came to signify, they want to do things, their time horizon is short. By comparison, intelligence people, those smellers of flowers and imaginers of coffins, they tend to overstate how unmalleable the world is, how nothing can affect what's going to happen. Their view tends to be long-term, not short. So sometimes I wonder that the conversation ever happens between intelligence and policy, but because there is just a different set of time horizons and habits and ability to do things.
So speaking of time horizons, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So please raise your hands high.
Back there in the back, trying to get over frontism.
So I don't want to sound like the uninformed cold warrior that I am, but do we see the Russians currently trying to buy influence in Western Europe, trying to reshape or shape political discourse? So funding and working cooperatively with the more Eurosceptic political groupings that are in Europe, and maybe trying to separate the United States from the Europeans?
In general, I think the answer to that is yes. Are they trying to work with the Eurosceptics? Is there some money moving? I would have no doubt that that's happening. Russia is such a hard problem to deal with because it is, in the long run, a failing state. And virtually everything Putin has done is hastening that failure. The problem is, as the saying has it, in the long run, we're all dead. And so dealing with Putin that has plenty of ability to create mischief in the short run, that is the challenge. I think I take him seriously when he poses much of what he's doing in defensive terms. I think he feels like we would like to overthrow him. We'd like to have a color revolution in Russia. We're sort of surrounding him. NATO is right at his doorstep. So all of that, I think, is part of it's a sort of aggressive defense, plus a desire to restore Russian grandeur on the global scene. I take him as sincere about all those things, but I also worry he's so isolated doesn't like coming to Moscow, doesn't see people before noon, spends his mornings working out and reading. Sounds like a pretty good life to me, but maybe it's not what you'd like a national leader to do. And so I worry, given his isolation, that the chances of a miscalculation, of him doing something that would trigger even an Article 5 response from NATO, that's one of the reasons Russia and Europe are kind of number 3 on my list. If I worry about the bad things that could happen, that's pretty near the top. Sir.
You mentioned that China is the national interest threat is on the number 1 in the list. So what would be the right strategy, the right engagement with China?
China's both an interesting and hard intelligence problem, but also a hard policy problem. And it's because we really haven't dealt with a country like it, maybe ever, and certainly not since sort of pre-World War II Germany, a country that was simultaneously an important economic partner, but also possibly a military competitor. And in Germany's case, Germany was a lot less important to us economically than China is, and it quickly resolved itself into an enemy, not just a competitor. So the fact that we find it hard to have a sort of steady policy toward China, it doesn't surprise me. It is difficult. I think the basic approach is more or less the one we're on, trying to engage China as much as we can. We've made a few mistakes, in my view, along the way, but trying to engage them as much as we can, while trying to be firm where we need to be, where things where not only our interests, but those of our allies are powerfully involved, like the South China Sea. But it's a hard balancing act to maintain. I was impressed by the George W. Bush administration, which really came to power full of China as peer competitor, a lot of concern about sort of confronting China, containing China. And by the end, they were saying quite openly, our task is to make sure we don't push China toward being an enemy. And I think that's still our task, basically, since we don't get to pick entirely. China has a vote, a big vote too, but we ought to, while demonstrating the kind of firmness we need to, try to make sure that we don't push them, encourage them to become an enemy. That would be silly. When I think about the U.S.-China economic relationship, it reminds me of the mutual assured destruction during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Yes, they could destroy our economy. Yes, we could destroy theirs. That'd be pretty stupid. and I hope we aren't that stupid, but it is a challenge. And trying to have some, one of the things from an intelligence perspective, one of the things I try and do is have a little balance. We're now in a period when almost everything China does gets perceived as negative. And I think that's not true. If you look at lots of their activities in Africa, sure, they've been seeking resources, haven't gotten many. And so a lot of the things they've done in Africa seem to me either not bad or a waste of money. And in neither case does that seem threatening to us. So trying to distinguish the things we really need to worry about from the things that just are, and are the result of China getting richer and more powerful, that I think is a challenge that we in the intelligence world have some responsibility for. Thank you very much. This has been great.
We've heard a lot of really deep questions. We've only asked you a few small things: how to deal with China, how to deal with Russia, how to deal with terrorism, how to deal with the global environment.
The hard questions I was going to pass to Adam and Tim.
That's right. They're going to get it. But and all of these questions, nobody has suggested a title for the next Global Trends document. So if you'd like to stick around for a couple of minutes and you can pass them your ideas in person, that's just fine. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Dr. Beck.
Thank you.